Last time we talked about IRR. And this is where we ended up. I think this is where we ended up. How many stars did we say IRR gets? 2.5. And why does it not get that full 3 stars? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the last one.
It tells you that you are creating wealth, but not how much.
Yeah, it tells you whether or not you're creating wealth, but it doesn't tell you how much. Okay, now, so far we know it's not perfect, but there are actually more problems to this thing. First of all, there is the problem with independent versus mutually exclusive projects. So, if 2 projects are independent, then they can both be done. The decision to do one has no impact whatsoever on the decision to do the other one. And so opening a McDonald's in San Antonio and one in Oklahoma City mutually, they're independent events. It doesn't matter. But what if you only had one piece of land in Springfield and you had to choose whether to open a McDonald's or a Chick-fil-A? That's a mutually exclusive project. You can either do McDonald's or you can do Chick-fil-A, but you can't do both because you've only got one piece of land. Does that make sense? Okay, now let's give some other examples of mutually exclusive projects. Let's think about your MBA. Undoubtedly, many of you were accepted also to Harvard and here, but could you have done both at the same time? No, they're mutually exclusive. I've got some good news for you though. Remember last time I told you, or maybe it's 2 times ago, that you guys get a better education here because you know about the problems with using a single WAC for all your projects. The other thing is that the school colors are exactly the same. Oh, and then, or I think we may be cheaper. So you guys made the right decision here. But it's mutually exclusive. You couldn't choose to do both. One final one. Can you, in this country, under our current laws, be married to more than one person at the same time? No. So if you get 3 marriage proposals, those are 3 mutually exclusive projects. You can't do all 3, right? You've got to choose one. So that's the difference between independent and mutually exclusive projects. Dating might be independent. Who knows? Maybe you could date 3 people at the same time, but you can only marry one. Okay. Any questions about those definitions before we move on? Okay, I'm going to give you an example here. This is a mutually exclusive example. So we've got a street corner in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is in Southern California. It's very warm, it's very dry. And we have 2 choices of what we can build there. By the way, we can only do one or the other. We can't do both. Students will often say, well, couldn't we do one during the day and one during the night? No, we can't. This is a mutually exclusive project. Now, project A is a snow cone stand. If you've ever been to Hawaii, they call it shave ice there. The idea is it's snow, and then they put some sticky sweet syrup over it, and everybody refers to them by their colors, not by their flavors. It's all artificial. That's a snow cone stand. Now, do you think a snow cone stand might do well in the hot, arid climate of California? Oh yeah, and you can do it year-round because it's pretty much hot and dry year-round. Now, that's the first one. The second one is a swanky nightclub. Does anyone know what swanky means? Oh wow, I get to teach you a new word today. Swanky means fancy or posh. Fancy or posh. Now, I was teaching the same class down in Mississippi, and I asked if anyone knew what swanky meant, and this girl raised her hand and she said, slutty? And I said, no, that's skanky, but thanks for trying. Okay, swanky is fancy or posh. Okay, now, I can't do both. And a lot of people say, well, couldn't you serve snow cones out of the nightclub? Turns out liquor laws don't want kids in the nightclub, so yeah, kids are your main snow cone customers, so the answer is no. Now, let's look at the cash flows. The cash flows for the snow cone stand, we invest $100 up front, and then we get 3 equal payments of $50 over the following 3 years. It's more expensive to build a fancy nightclub, so we're going to have to spend $1,000 up front, but then the cash flows after that are $450, $450, and 450. So here's what we want to do. We want to put these into our CF. You guys remember CF? Get your calculator out. And we're going to say CF second clear work. What should I put in for CF0?
Negative 1000.
Yeah, 100 negative. We're going to do project A first. Negative. Enter. Arrow down. What do I do for C01? 15. Enter. Arrow down. What do I do for F01?
Nothing.
3. Why 3?
3 years.
Yeah, we got 3 cash flows that are identical in a row. They've got to be in a row. Okay, now, by the way, the required rate of return for both snow cone stands and nightclubs are 10%. So we got to have 10% return here. So we're going to do a couple of things. First thing is we're going to calculate the IRR. What button do I hit to get the IRR? Yeah, very good, IRR. And then, Ms. Roll, what button do I hit?
Compute.
Yeah, compute. And I see that it's 23.375%. Now, do you remember last time that we did a problem and we came up with an IRR of 23.375%? That's not a coincidence, and here's the reason why. Because we have the same pattern of cash flows. The first cash flow out is twice as big as the next 3 cash flows in. And as long as those proportions hold, the IRR will always be 23.375%. And so this could have been 1,000, 500, 500, 500. It could have been minus 2,000, minus 2,000, minus 1,000, minus 2,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. Any of those sets of cash flows would still give me 23.375%. So I want you to go ahead and write down 23.375% there in the IRR box. And while we have those cash flows in here, I want to go ahead and calculate the NPV. Ms. Knight, what button should I hit to calculate NPV? NPV, very good. Now, we said the required return here was 10. Enter, arrow down. Ms. Dowden, what should I do now?
Compute.
Yeah, compute. And I'm getting 24.34. So go ahead and write down 24.34 there in that box for NPV under Project A. Okay, now we've done all the calculations we can for Project A, so let's go and do Project B. I'm going to hit CF, and then what should I do? Yeah, second clear work. And what should I put in for CF0? 1,000 plus minus. Enter. What next?
450.
Arrow down. And then 450. Got to hit the enter button. And then arrow down. What's at 01? 3. Very good. 3. Enter. And so, let's see. I want to find the IRR. Mr. Ali, what button would I hit to find the IRR? Yeah, very good. And Ms. Black, what button do I hit next?
Compute.
Compute. Now the IRR here is 16.65%. So we've got Project A has an IRR of 23.375%, and Project B has this, and go ahead and write that down in the slide, has an IRR around 16.65%. Which one of those sounds better to you? A, right? Wouldn't we rather have a higher return? Yeah. And so if we were purely looking at IRR to choose between these two mutually exclusive projects, we would choose Project A. But remember, the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. So what we're actually interested in is the project with the greatest NPV. So how can I find NPV? Yeah, I'm gonna hit NPV here. And then what do we say the required rate of return is? 10. Enter, arrow down, compute. I'm getting an NPV of 119.08. 119.08. So we said that the NPV for Project A was 24.34, and for Project B is 119.08. Which project should we accept? B. And so do you see that IRR and NPV can lead to different decisions for a mutually exclusive project? Now, what if these projects weren't mutually exclusive? What would we do? Yeah, we'd accept both of them because remember, the rule is we accept all positive NPV projects, but they are mutually exclusive, and so we only accept the one with the highest NPV, because after all, the goal of financial management is to maximize shareholder wealth. Project B does that a lot better than Project A. Questions? Okay, so that's the first problem we see with IRR. And we've got another problem here. And these are unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. My dogs just went outside. Unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. Now, what does that mean? A conventional cash flow has only one sign change. The one you see the most often is negative at time zero and the rest of them positive, but it doesn't have to be that way. Because we talked last time about how it often takes like 3 years to build a factory. So you can have negative cash flows at time 0, time 1, time 2, and time 3, and then positive cash flows beyond that. It would still only be one sign change, and it would still be conventional cash flows, and everything would be cool. But sometimes we have what are called unconventional or non-conventional cash flows where we have more than one sign change. We're going to have more than one sign change. Let me explain to you a couple of examples where this might happen. The first one is coal mining. In the United States, the way that we get coal out of the earth is we go in and we knock the top off of a mountain that contains coal, and we scoop that coal out. When you knock the top of the mountain off, of course, that's a huge cash flow out because you're having to pay for all that equipment and diesel fuel and whatnot. But then you've got positive cash flows, hopefully, as you mine the coal out of the mountain. However, the interesting thing is in the United States, the U.S. government requires at the end that we rebuild the mountain. Can you imagine that? Having to rebuild a mountain? But that's what we have to do. And so they go out and spend a lot of money to go ahead and rebuild that mountain, meaning that we've got a negative cash flow at the end. So we have negative at the beginning, we have a sign change to positive, then we go through the life of the mine, and at the end we have a negative. A more common one would be the gas station. If I'm going to go build a gas station, I have to, of course, got to put in the pumps and all that. But where is the gasoline actually stored? In the ground. There are tanks there. I worked with a girl in Louisiana, and she's like, how do they know where to put the gas station? Where do they know where the gasoline is in the ground? I'm like, no, that's not how this works, right? Okay, so the gas has to be put in these tanks. And so we've got this huge expenditure up front for the tanks, the pumps, the store, all of that. And then we have hopefully positive cash flows, net cash flows over the life of the convenience store. And then at the end, the United States government makes you do something very interesting. They make you come in and dig up the tanks. And then they make you scrape the dirt from around the tanks. And then you have to take that soil off to be treated, usually by burning. Why? Contamination, because it's possible for those tanks to leak. Do you guys know that? So anything that you put in the ground, especially if it's made out of carbon steel, eventually is going to corrode and you might have leaks. So what we do, we take those tanks out of the ground, we get rid of the dirt around them, we take it off, we burn it, we cut back and we fill back the hole. And so what we see there is we have huge negative cash flow up front, then we have positive cash flows through the life of the convenience store, and then at the very end we have another huge negative cash flow as we clean up the mess. And so it's not unusual to see these unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. What is unusual is how IRR responds to them. So let's take a look at this project here, and I've got it horizontal instead of vertical, so don't let that screw you up. We're going to say CF second work. What should CF0 be? Yeah, 100, negative, enter, arrow down. What's C01? What's C01? 230, thank you. 230, enter, arrow down. What's F01? 1, very good. Ooh, no, just 1. C02, what's it? Yeah, 132, negative, enter. And of course, F02 is just 1. Now I'm gonna hit my, oh bless you. I'm gonna hit IRR here in compute, and I get 10%. Let's check that number and see if it's actually correct. We're going to say NPV. We'll put this in 10, enter, arrow down, and we're going to compute NPV. If this truly is the IRR, what should NPV also, what's the definition say? NPV must be 0. So we're going to compute, and that star says that it computed, and sure enough, it's 0. And I'm going to show you something else. What if instead I go arrow up, and I put in 20, enter, arrow down, compute. This time I'm getting -5 times 10 to the -13th. And if you remember the little interpretive dance I did last time where I walked across the room and counted with my fingers, I don't have 12 fingers, so I can't do that for you today. But the idea is that we're gonna have 12 zeros and a 5. And that 0.01 would be 1 cent. And so we know basically that we have another 0 NPV here. And it turns out that every time you have a sign change in your cash flows, you're going to have another NPV equals 0 case. And so you're going to end up with multiple IRRs. In this case, we only have 2 sign changes, so we have 2 IRRs. What do you think would happen if we had 3 sign changes? How many IRRs would we have? 3. And if we have 4, we're going to have 4, and so forth. So let's go back and say IRR. You say, I'll bet if we say IRR compute, and then we hit arrow down, it'll show us the other one. Nope. Calculator's lazy. Calculator gets to the first one and says, found it. Now, so far, we don't know exactly why this is a problem, but let's take a look at this thing, which is a graph of NPV versus the discount rate. NPV versus the discount rate. And by the way, the rule is we accept projects when the IRR is greater than the discount rate. Okay, keeping that in mind, we see here that between a 0 and discount rate of 10%, the NPV is actually negative. If we only look at that first IRR of 10% and our discount rate is 5%, the IRR rule would tell us to accept the project because IRR greater than the discount rate. But at that point, NPV is actually negative. And so the IRR rule falls down. The IRR rule falls down when we have this unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. So let's take it a little further. What if we have a discount rate of 15%? Well, if we have an IRR of 10% and a discount rate of 15%, the rule would tell us to reject the project. The rule would tell us to reject the project. But hey, where is NPV at 15%? It's positive. Do you see that? And so we get messed up here on making decisions because of these unconventional cash flows giving us multiple IRRs. So here's what I want you to know. Anytime you see unconventional or non-conventional cash flows, immediately wipe IRR from your mind. You are not going to be using IRR. You're not going to be using IRR for mutually exclusive projects, and you're not going to be using IRR for these unconventional cash flows because they give us multiple IRRs. Questions? Yes?
So rarely we take IRR above NPV except for these instances and then NPV.
We never take IRR over NPV. So NPV, remember we said it works every time. As long as you're not putting garbage into it, it works every time, assuming that we have money for the assumptions for NPV. Now, IRR occasionally, usually NPV and IRR go together. But what I'm telling you is there are some cases where IRR and NPV don't go together. And in those cases, we always trust NPV. When you find yourself backed into a corner and the rules are giving you different decisions, always go with NPV. Remember, NPV is the gold standard. It's the only 3-star measure that we've talked about. And it's the only one that we will talk about. The rest of them are either 2.5 or below. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay. So, we've discussed that IRR has these problems, and yet we see that people still use it quite a bit. Why do they do that? Well, first of all, it sums up a project in a single number that people have this internal instinctive understanding of. So, let's start with this question. What kind of person do you think is more likely to become the CEO of the firm? A finance person or a marketing person? Marketing, very good. And there are several reasons for that. Number one, if we're going to talk about purely scientific stuff, the marketing person is supposed to know the market. They should have a better feel for the overall business of the company. Does that make sense? Also, finance people tend to be not all that social. You know, I really don't even like people. Marketing people, they seem to like people, right? They like, yeah, hey, let's go out for drinks after work. I'm like, I'm gonna go take a nap, right? Okay, so marketing people, they're more social. A couple of reasons why marketing people tend to end up on top. Now, the question is this: if I'm trying to explain to a marketing CEO about whether a project is good or bad, I can either tell them that the NPV is $127,000, or I can say the IRR is 17%. Which one's more likely to be meaningful to the marketing person? By the way, any marketing people in here? Are you going to remember NPV 20 years from now when you're in charge? Absolutely not. But will you remember that your mortgage is 7%? Yeah. Will you remember that your car loan is 6.5%? Yeah. Will you remember that your retirement's getting about 12%? Yeah. And so all those numbers are in his head, and we present him with the 17%. What does it sound like to you? Is that a good deal? Yeah. Now, here's the problem. You got to be very careful. If the NPV is negative, but the IRR looks attractive, don't show your boss the IRR, because then you will never be able to explain to them that this is a bad decision. And by the way, when would an IRR of 17% be bad? When the project's so risky that it requires 21%. Does that make sense? That project would have a negative NPV, even though that 17% sounds huge and juicy. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's reason number one. And number two, if the IRR is high enough, you might not even need to know what the appropriate discount rate is. And by the way, that's what Chapter 12 was all about. It's not easy to find the discount rate. If we could get by without doing it, we would be pleased to do so. So let's look at replacing the company pickup truck. If I could show you that the IRR for that was like 45%, would it matter whether the discount rate was 7%, 12%, or even 25%? Absolutely not. There's no need for us to even figure out a discount rate at that point. This is what we would call a no-brainer. Right? We would go ahead and do it. So there are at least two reasons why we would still use IRR. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about profitability index. Profitability index is a tool that we're going to use when capital is scarce. Remember, I told you that NPV assumes that you can always get all the money you need to invest in any positive NPV project, but sometimes that's just not the case. And so that's where profitability index comes in. So we're going to start with this definition of profitability index, which I really don't like, but it's the present value of cash flow subsequent to initial investment divided by initial investment. Now, what does subsequent to mean?
Is it following?
Yeah, following or after. Okay, so we're really looking at the present value of the cash flows that happen after the initial investment and divide by the initial investment. You need to make a note right here. Initial investment here is positive. Initial investment here is positive. Initial investment here is positive. We're used to thinking of initial investment as a negative cash outflow. It is. It's a negative cash flow. But for purposes of this calculation, initial investment is positive. Okay. Now, remember that our definition of NPV from the book was present value of cash flow subsequent to initial investment minus the initial investment. And if I do a little bit of rearranging, what I can do is figure out that this is actually initial investment plus NPV divided by initial investment. So just substitution principle, because we know that initial investment plus NPV is equal to the present value of the cash flows subsequent to initial investment. And then we can do a little bit of algebra magic. What's initial investment divided by initial investment? Yeah, it's just 1, right? And so what we've really got here is 1 plus NPV over initial investment. 1 plus NPV over initial investment. Remember, initial investment is positive. Initial investment is positive. Now, let's think this through. We can actually use the NPV rule to figure out what the PI rule for acceptance should be. We accept all projects with NPV positive, greater than 0, right? And so let's say I throw 0 in here. The PI would be how much? 1, right? And so if I put an NPV anything greater than 0 in here, the PI will then be greater than 1. Does that make sense? And so that's how we arrive at our rule. We accept all projects with PI greater than 1. So far, we haven't done anything extraordinary above and beyond what we did for NPV. So far this thing looks kind of useless. What do we need for it? We need the same things we need for NPV, because after all, NPV is in there. We don't need anything else that we don't need for NPV. And at this point, you may be thinking, wait a minute, is he going to make a meatloaf speech about this? And the answer is no. The answer is no. This thing still has a use, unlike discounted payback. So let's talk about profitability index and our investment rule or criteria. Does it account for the time value of money?
Yes.
Yeah, things got NPV in it, right? Does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows?
Yes.
Yeah, things got NPV in it, and to do NPV, we had to have the appropriate discount rate given the risk of the project. And does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? You say no. Anyone want to say yes? Yeah, turns out you're both right. It provides information in that if it's greater than 1, we know we are creating wealth, but we don't know how much. In the absence of knowledge about the initial investment, we don't know how much wealth we are creating. And so we're going to end up having to give this thing 2.5 stars. In fact, we're going to do it for exactly the same reasons as IRR, because it tells us the amount, it tells us that wealth has been created or destroyed, but it doesn't tell us how much. Questions? What was the only other 2.5 star rating? Yeah, IRR. How many stars did Payback get? 0. How many stars did AAR get? 0. Very good. Okay, so when is this thing useful? During capital rationing. Remember we said that the base assumption of NPV is that if we have positive NPV projects, we can always find investors to give us the money to do those projects. That's not always true. Let's talk about situations in which it might not be true. What if you were a startup company? You're a startup company, you have no track record whatsoever, and you come to me, I'm the venture capitalist, and you ask me to invest in your firm. And you say, we've got 7 projects, and together the NPV is $5 million. Will you invest $2 million in our company? I'm going to tell you no. I'm going to say I'm going to give you $500,000 and see what you can do with $500,000. Immediately now, you have to choose from between your 7 projects, which of them is going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest bang for the buck. And so how are you going to do that? You are going to figure the PI for each of these, profitability index for each of them, and then we are going to rank them in descending order. What does descending mean? Are we getting smaller or bigger? Yeah, we're getting smaller. Okay, let me give you one more example of a time when capital rationing might happen. What if you are an old company and you've been doing a crummy job? And so it's like my first employer out of college, we've been doing a bad job, so people didn't want to invest in our projects. And so at that time, we had scarce capital, capital rationing. By the way, rationing, you guys know about rationing of food? And you ration food. If you had enough food for everybody to eat everything they wanted, would you have rationing? No. And so rationing, by its very nature, means that we don't have enough to do everything we want. And so that's why we're talking about capital rationing here. We don't have enough money to do all these projects. And so you can see this at an old struggling company. You can see it at a brand new company. So we are going to start out, and we're going to start down this list, and we will start accepting projects until we run out of money. And so I'm going to give you an example here. We said we're doing these in descending order. So this first one is going to be 3.7. This one is 2.6. This one is 2.4. This one is 1.9. By the way, if I have a project with anything less than 1 as far as a PI, should I put it on this list? No. I'll give you one possible exception to that here in a minute. Okay. Now, what I need to tell you is that you have $1 million to invest. Project A, do we accept or reject? Accept for 2 reasons. Number 1, the PI is high, right? Number 2, we have enough money. So how much money do we have left after that? We've got $500,000. Okay, Project B has a PI of 2.6, costs $100,000. Should we do that? Yeah. Now we say, now how much money are we down to now?
400,000.
400,000. Very good. Now Project C costs exactly 400,000.
You can accept it.
We can accept it, and we should. Now I will tell you this. Do you think it's going to necessarily cost exactly 400,000? Do you remember what I told you earlier about sometimes our initial cash flows are off? Yeah. And by the way, when you see which way initial cash flows are off, how often do you think it's, oh hey, that cost us less than we thought? Rarely, right? So, you might be squeaking it, but theoretically we would go ahead and accept it. What about Project D?
We reject. We don't have money.
We gotta reject it, right? We gotta reject it because we just don't have enough money. And so what would we do? We would accept these 3 and we would save Project D hopefully for next year. Does that make sense? So doing this gives us the biggest bang for the buck. So let me give you one more example, and this is the example where you might end up accepting a PI less than 1, and it's simply because the government's involved. What does FEMA stand for? Federal Emergency. Oh, you're close. First 2 words are correct. Federal Emergency. You don't know? What's that?
Management.
Yeah, very good. Federal Emergency Management Agency. Very good. Okay, now what does FEMA do? My wife and I lived down in Mississippi right after Hurricane Katrina, and the FEMA was all over down there. And what they did was they came in after the hurricane, and the first thing they did is they brought in food and ice. By the way, ice is important when you have no electricity. Any idea why? Yeah, keep your food from spoiling, right? And so food and ice and laundry facilities, and then they brought in trailers for people to live in because their houses were gone. And then the other thing that I noticed was that there were all these blue roofs. So the FEMA comes around immediately after the storm and they'll nail a blue tarp on your roof of your house because your shingles are gone, the water can come in, they're trying to limit the damage. Does that make sense? Okay, now, can FEMA prevent a hurricane? No. Can FEMA prevent a tornado? No. Can FEMA prevent flooding? No. But they can prevent flood damage, and here's how. FEMA can go in and buy up flood-prone structures and tear them down. FEMA can go in and buy up flood-prone structures and tear them down. By the way, why do they have to be torn down? I mean, we could just buy the person out, right? What happens if you just buy the person out and they pack up their stuff and move? What's going to happen at that house?
Looters.
Say again?
Looters.
Looters. First the looters come. All the copper pipe gets ripped out of the house. Okay, well, who comes after the looters? The homeless people. Homeless people. Probably people are going to try cooking meth in there. Lonely teenagers looking for love. Who knows, right? All sorts of bad elements. So nothing good is going to happen if we leave that house out. So not only do we have to buy the house, we have to tear it down. Now, by the way, where do you think these flood-prone houses are? They are next to rivers, right? Do people like to live by the river? Do you ever hear about riverfront property and oceanfront property? Oh yeah, people love to live on the water. Now let's talk about how flood insurance in the United States works. If you live by one of these rivers and you get flooded out, the U.S. government comes by and gives you money and pats you on the head and says, oh, you poor thing. Now, what do you think happens? What do those people tend to want to do? Rebuild in exactly the same place. Does that make sense? I mean, if other people are going to come by and get me a new house every few years, why not? Does that make sense? Okay, so this is why FEMA needs to buy these people out and tear the house down, and then we're going to have to declare this into some sort of park or something to keep more people from trying to build a house there. Okay, so let's talk about how this program works. Every year, Congress passes a budget, and in that budget, there is a certain amount of money set aside for buying up these flood-prone properties. And then the FEMA will put out what's called an RFP, a request for proposal, where they ask people to tell them about a flood-prone property, to estimate how much it would take to cost to buy it, and to estimate how much it would take to tear it down. And further, they need to look at these future positive cash flows that are going to result from this. What are the future positive cash flows that result from buying up one of these places and tearing it down? Is it really future positive cash flows, or
Prevention of future negatives.
yeah, it's prevention of future negative cash flows, right? Because if we let these people keep living there, we're just going to keep rebuilding the house over and over and over again. Does that make sense? Okay, so as a result, we're going to estimate what those future savings are based on the flood maps and all this kind of stuff, and of course, the expense of the dwelling. Now, when you get through doing your proposal in the upper right-hand corner, you have to calculate and write your PI. And then everybody sends that in to Washington, D.C., and I can only assume that there is an intern sitting at a desk in Washington, and their first job is to put all of those applications in order of descending PI. They probably get a lot of paper cuts while they're doing that. They put them in descending order of PI. Could it be electronic? Yes, but that would make sense, so you know the government's not going to do that. So what are they going to do then? They start working their way down through the pile until one of two things happens. One, they run out of money, which is the more likely thing, or two, they run out of applications. And if they've got money from Congress and the PI is less than one and they still got money, they're going to go ahead and fund that project. Let's see here. So it's not only useful for companies, it's also useful for the government. And it's for the same reason in both cases. There's not an unlimited amount of capital available. There's not, so we've got capital ration. Questions? Okay, so let's take a look at PI and how it can lead to bad decisions for mutually exclusive projects. So if I remember correctly, the NPV for the snow cone stand was 24.34. Is that correct? Okay, 24.34. So go ahead and write that down. And then, if I remember correctly, the NPV for the nightclub, bless you again. So those sneezes are entirely too small and cute. You can't let that out. It will destroy you. So go ahead and let loose. Okay, so the NPV for Project B is 119.08. Is that correct? Okay. Now, we are going to use that information now to figure out what is the PI for both of these. The PI for the first one would be 1 plus 24.34 divided by 100. Remember, additional investment is positive here. 24.34 divided by 100 is 0.2434. We add 1, therefore the PI is 1.2434. Is my math correct?
No.
No! It's not. What do you get?
Not bad.
Not bad. What do you get? Yeah. Oh. Ms. Rolfe, I'm glad that you're confident. You know, if you're gonna hit a wrong note when you sing it loud. You're doing fine. Okay, so PI is 1.2434. Now let's look at the other one. We got 119.08 divided by 1,000. That's going to give us 0.11908. We add that to 1 to get our PI, 1.11908 or something like that. Does that sound right? Okay. Now, which would you rather have? Just look at this. Would you rather have 1.2434 or 1.119? Yeah, you'd rather have the first one. But it's the same problem that we saw with IRR. And it's for the same reason. Both IRR and PI ignore the scale of the project. Actually, I needed to say that about IRR. Why would the lower IRR project have a higher NPV? And the answer is the scale of the project. Remember, we could only invest $100 at the higher IRR for Project A, but we can invest $1,000 for the lower IRR. And it turns out that that's going to make you more money. If I could invest in multiple Project A's, I would do that, but I can't. There's only the one. Okay, the same problem here. And the reason that PI doesn't take account of the scale of the project is because we're dividing by initial investment. And so we're looking at the NPV as a proportion of the initial investment. And so once again, it ignores the scale of the project. So the reason that neither IRR nor profitability index works for mutually exclusive projects is because they both ignore the scale of the project. They both ignore the scale of the project. Okay, so once again, we make a bad decision here. But do we have the same problem as we did with IRR with multiple IRRs? The answer is no. We do not have to worry about unconventional and unconventional cash flows here because we are using NPV in essence to make the decision, and NPV does not have a problem with unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. So they only share the first problem of mutually exclusive projects. They don't share the second problem of unconventional cash flows. Any questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about what happens in the real world. A bunch of finance professors sent out surveys to the top financial thinker at a bunch of firms. And they broke those firms into large firms and small firms. In other words, it's not just all Fortune 500 companies. They're doing the whole spectrum here. And they said, on a scale of 0 to 4, where 0 is never and 4 is always, how often do you use the following measures? And the top two were IRR and NPV. Now let's talk about why the rating for both those would be so very close. And the answer is this. If I have the stuff to do NPV, it's very easy to do IRR. So those cash flows are already in your calculator. What have you got to do? IRR compute, and you're good to go, right? Plus, it's this number that marketing people will understand. And so we see that IRR gets done about the same frequency as NPV. Now, the interesting thing is the difference between large firms and small firms. So let's think about small firms. The first financial thinker a small firm is likely to hire. Is it likely to be an accountant, or is it likely to be a finance person? Yeah, accountant. We've got to have someone that will figure our taxes and keep us out of jail. And so the first financial thinker we hire is going to be an accountant. And so we're going to see that, yes, we'll have more NPV and IRR type thinking at larger firms because they're more likely to have finance thinkers involved, true finance people. Now, let's ask this question. What do you think is the difference in the size of the projects between small firms and large firms? I mean, this is one of those-
Small firms with small projects.
Yeah, small firms tend to have small projects, and we said with small projects, it might not be worth doing NPV. It might not be worth doing NPV, and so we see that they do use it fewer times, simply because they probably have an accountant as their chief financial thinker, and they also have small projects. It makes perfect sense. Now let's move on down. The payback method is the next most popular, and this time it's used more frequently at small firms than large firms. And that follows right along with what we just got through saying, that we are less likely to have true finance people at these small firms, and that the projects tend to be smaller, so it makes perfect sense that payback will be more popular at small firms than at large firms. And then we have the discounted payback. I am disgusted and ashamed that this one even shows up on the list. Just go ahead and scratch that off. Let's talk about the accounting rate of return. The accounting rate of return, thankfully, gets not used all that often. It does get used more often at small firms, and I think that's likely due to the fact that small firms are more likely to have accountants as their top financial thinker rather than having a finance person. And then finally, down at the bottom, we have the profitability index. And we see that the profitability index is seldom used at either large firms or small firms. Now, I'm going to tell you something about this study. This study was of all United States firms. There were not firms outside the United States. And I'm going to take this as a victory for the U.S. capital markets. If you've got a good project, you can always get the money to fund them. And so there's very little use for tools for capital rationing. And so they're not used all that often. I had a young lady from Vietnam. She sat right here. And she said, no, 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 no. And this is before I told her it was all US. And she says, we have capital rationing all the time. And then I said, oh, where are you from? And she said, Vietnam. Let's talk about Vietnam. Vietnam, first of all, developing economy. Does that make sense? So they don't have these well-developed capital markets. Secondly, they have a system where the government owns the banks. You are a loan officer at one of these government banks, and you have two clients come to you. You've got a private company that's just starting up, and you have an established government company that's been around for a while. Which one of those are you going to loan to? Yeah, you're going to lend, even if it's not established, you're going to lend to the government company because it has the implicit backing of the government. And by the way, who pays your paycheck? The government. Does that make sense? And so in countries like China and Vietnam, having positive NPV projects might not be as important as having good contacts in the government. And so in countries like hers, it ends up where they end up using profitability index a whole lot more often because they are often faced with capital rationing. In fact, sometimes the only capital they get is the capital they produce from within. In other words, the net income, and they subtract out the dividends, what's left is the addition to retained earnings. That's all they have to work with. And so they need to figure out how to do the very most that they can with that small amount of money that they have to work with. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is the end of chapter 7. Are there any questions before we move on to chapter 8? Okay. Chapter 8 is about making capital investment decisions. So we talked about how to come up with a discount rate. We've talked about the different rules. And then chapter 8 is really more focused. It's going to focus in on NPV primarily. And of course, we're going to calculate IRR because it's so easy to do so. But this is how we're going to be making our decisions. First of all, we need to look at what kind of flows that we're going to use. We are going to end up discounting these future cash flows, but what should be in those? Well, it should be real cash flows, not accounting numbers. So, accounting numbers have these non-cash expenses. What's an example of a non-cash expense? Yeah, depreciation is one. What's it called? The deferred tax is another one, right? And so there are these not real cash flows in accounting numbers. We also have the fact that accounts payable, it shows up in your costs, but it hasn't really cost you any cash yet. Accounts receivable shows up as money you've already gotten from an accounting perspective, but it's not cash that you've actually received. So there's all sorts of stuff that we have to make sure we're not using accounting numbers because they don't represent real cash flows. By the way, what do you have to pay your bills?
Money.
Yeah, real cash, right? Okay, now the next thing we need to talk about are incremental cash flows. What kind of cash flows? Incremental cash flows. Cash flows that will only be different as a result of taking on a project. Cash flows that will only be different as a result of taking on the project. We are going to call those incremental cash flows, and we're going to say that cash flows that will occur regardless of our decision are not going to be included in our analysis. So I'll give you an example. Today I'm giving a talk to the faculty senate about the budget at the university. And I'm just throwing out crazy thinking there, trying to get people to open their minds. And one of the things that I say is we could eliminate athletics and save $15.2 billion a year. By the way, did you guys know that our athletic program costs us $15.2 million per year more than it brings in? If you take that number, and 8.4 million of that is funded by tuition and fees. If you divide by the number of full-time equivalent students here, that means you guys are each paying $513 a year extra just to have the athletics program. Are you guys in for that? The majority, I wouldn't think the majority of students wouldn't be, but we don't have that kind of numbers out there, so I'm putting them out there. Now, when I brought up that we could do this, and of course I know we're not going to get rid of athletics, but I want people to start thinking. And one of the things that someone said is, oh, but if we get rid of athletics, we've still got these bonds that we have to pay off that are funding we were used to fund the basketball arena, football stadium, things like that. Those cash flows aren't going to change as a result of doing this crazy thing that I'm talking about. Should we consider them? No, they're not incremental. They're not incremental. They're not going to change. Okay, and then we need to think about cash flows that could happen if we reject the project. So, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but what if we had a building? And if we don't use the building for our project, we could sell it. We should include that as one of our cash flows. And so you always want to look at each one of these things and say, will my decision on the project impact the cash flow? If the answer is yes, then that change would be the incremental cash flow. Not the total cash flow, just the amount that it changes would be your incremental cash flow. And it's only the incremental cash flows that we're going to look at. Now let's talk about sunk costs. Sunk costs are money that's already been spent that we can't get back regardless of the project decision. That money that we borrowed to build the arena, that money's gone, right? We still have to pay those bonds regardless. So that would be a sunk cost. I'm reminded of a Shakespeare quote, "What's done is done and cannot be undone." Have you ever heard that? What's done is done and cannot be undone. It doesn't matter whether these, what we do today, it's not going to change these things. So should we consider them in our project? No, absolutely not. They're not incremental. They're not incremental. Okay, now let's give some examples of these sunk costs. I've already told you about the arena and football field. Let's talk about marketing surveys. Assume that I am a dairy guy. I have a lot of goats and I milk these goats and I get milk out of the goats. Now, the goats, I'm making a boatload of milk here and I'm trying to sell more of the milk. And I wonder if people would drink chocolate goat milk. And so what do? I go to my marketing person and I say, I would like you to find out whether people would sell or buy chocolate goat milk. Now, I'm going to ask the marketing expert here. How do we figure that out?
Like surveys.
A survey. So I'm going to mail them a form that says, would you drink chocolate goat milk? How many people do you think have actually ever tried chocolate goat milk? No. So we'll strike that idea. What's your next idea?
To see if people would actually drink it.
Yeah. How are we going to do that?
Give samples.
Samples. I like this. Where are you going to set up to do that?
Market.
Yeah, you're going to go into some place where people actually gather. We used to would have said the mall, but no one goes there anymore. So go to where people gather. Hopefully your core demographic that you're trying to reach, which in this case I think would be kids. So you want to go to places where there are kids and you're going to do sampling, right? Now, how much are you going to charge me for this marketing survey?
Probably not that much.
Oh my goodness! This is a business school, man. How are you going to make money like that?
It depends on how much you're actually getting.
We did a marketing thing for our re-image our brand at the health department. And it was like $25,000 just to do this marketing thing. And all they did was get in a group of our clients and ask them questions and, and come up with colors that people would recognize. And it was $25,000 just for that.
And I will tell you that is cheating.
Yeah.
I have never been involved with a marketing survey that cost less than $250,000. By the way, as a taxpayer in the city of Springfield, by the way, she works for the Springfield Green County Health Department. Where does the money come from to pay for those marketing things?
Their taxes.
Yeah! Are you pleased for your taxes to be going to that? I'm not. It's like city utilities spend a bunch of money on redoing their logo. It's a monopoly! Can you say, well, I don't like city utilities logo, so I'm going to get my electricity from someone else? No! It's a total waste of money. But I digress. Back to the story. You got off to $25,000. Typically $250,000. So if anyone asks you, throw out $250 and see, then if they flinch, then back down. If they don't, go for it, man. And know that you should ask for $300 next time, right? Okay, back to the story. So what if I tell you that if you come back with the answer that people like goat milk, I'm going to pay you $250,000. But if you come back with the answer that people don't like goat milk, I'm not going to pay you anything. What will your answer always be?
Yeah, they like it.
Yeah! We're talking about people in marketing that have the moral flexibility to tell 15-year-old boys that body spray can help you get lucky, right? So we're not talking about people who deal in a lot of truth here. The only way I'm gonna get truth out of this guy is by paying him the same either way. Okay, so let's assume that, and he does give me an honest opinion because I'm gonna pay him either way. He says, yeah, people love goat milk. And so now that $250,000 that I've spent, should I include that as one of the cash flows for the project? No, because that money is gone, right? It's gone. There's no way I can get it back. Does that make sense? Okay, another sunk cost that we look at typical would be the environmental survey. Let's use the state of California for an example. If you're going to build a new gas station in the state of California, you have to bring in the following experts. You have to bring in a hydrologist to make sure that the rainwater runoff from your gas station isn't going to pollute any sensitive waterways. You have to bring in an endangered species specialist to make sure that this place that you're going to build isn't going to disturb the primary breeding grounds for any environment or any endangered species. And we have to bring in an archaeologist or an anthropologist to do a survey at the site to make sure that there aren't any remnants of ancient Native American civilizations. And so I have to pay each one of those people for their time. I'm probably going to pay, let's say, $10,000 to each one of them. Now, let's assume that I get all three of them out there and they all say, oh yeah, you're good to go. Now I have paid them $30,000. Do I consider that as a cash flow for my project of building this gas station? No, that money's gone. And by the way, it could have been that the hydrologist and the endangered species people told me, yeah, everything's cool. And then the Native American archaeology person comes in and says, whoa, this is an entirely new tribe we've never seen before. There's no way you can build a gas station here. Now, first of all, they're still going to be expecting to get paid $10,000. And the second thing is, now you're not going to be able to do the project. So what I'm telling you here is that $30,000 you're going to have to spend either way. As a result, it's not incremental. We consider it a sunk cost, and we don't include it in our analysis. Does that make sense? Okay. Now let's talk about opportunity costs. I like to take naps in the afternoon. That's probably around an hour. Now, do you think there are other things that I could be doing other than taking a nap?
No.
I didn't say that there were better things I could be doing. I said, are there other things? Yeah, sure, right? And if I were working an hourly job, how many of you work an hourly job? Yeah, so when you take an hour off, let's say you're taking a nap, it costs you your hourly wage. Your next best use of your time would have been working at work. So that's how much that you've given up. We have to account for these opportunity costs because they're real. If I didn't take the nap, I could work the extra hour, I could make the extra amount of money. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what do we talk about with opportunity costs in these projects? Well, our favorite example would be the empty warehouse. The empty warehouse. Now, we are getting ready to put in a manufacturing site, and we already own this empty warehouse, and it's fully depreciated. We don't have to pay any taxes on it. There's no cash flows whatsoever associated with this building. Should I include a cash flow in my capital budgeting analysis to represent that building? Your instincts say, no, but it's wrong. Here's why. What could we do with the building if we don't do the project?
Sell it.
Yeah, we could sell it. We could sell it. And so that is an incremental cash flow. That's an opportunity cost that we need to account for. Now the next question is, how do we come up with that number? An empty warehouse here, how do I find out how much it's worth? Say again. Appraisal. This is the number one student answer, appraisal. An appraiser is a person, is a professional, and they will come out and look at something and they will compare it to comparable properties in your area, and you pay them and then they tell you what it's worth. I'm going to tell you that there's an even better way to go about it. We can get this number for free. What kind of person might do the same kind of work for you, but tell you what the value is for free?
Tax.
Oh, no. So you're talking about assessed value. That is number 2 student answer. What's that? Number 2 student answer is the assessed value. I can tell you for sure from just looking at the assessed value of my house versus what houses in my neighborhood are going for, those numbers are right. What else? Anybody here have relatives that sell real estate? Oh, good. I'm not gonna. Oh, you do. Okay. Is your mom? Okay. So please don't be insulted by what I'm about to say. So let me tell you about when I'm going to sell a house. Here's what I always do. I always call 3 realtors. And I always say, I am thinking about selling my house. Have I promised to sell the house? No. I'm interviewing realtors. Have I promised to go with them even if I decide to sell the house? No. And then I say, are you interested in putting together a proposal? And what does mom always say?
Yeah.
Yeah! Okay, so here's what happens. I line these people up for 3 nights in a row at my house. Doorbell rings. I open the door, and there stands a lady in too much jewelry and too much perfume. Does this sound like your mom? Yeah, okay. Okay, so lady, too much jewelry, too much perfume, and she brings in a binder. And we sit at the kitchen table, and she starts flipping through the binder. And the first third of it is all about how freaking great she is. Oh, look, I sold over $1 million in 2011, over $1 million in 2012, over $2 million in 2013, and she goes through all this stuff. And then she talks about all the work that she does for the community, and blah, 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 big brothers, little sisters, whatever. Okay, and I'm like, okay, that's great, you're obviously a great person. And then she starts to talk about comparable sales in my neighborhood. Now I start to really listen. And she goes through and she talks about these recent sales. By the way, the listed price on Realtor.com, is that the same as the sales price? No. The sales price is only visible to people who have access to that in the multiple listing service system. So I don't have access to that except through a realtor, or appraisers have it too. Okay, so she's going to show what these houses actually sold for. She's going to talk about what are the differences between my house and that house. And so she's going to have to make adjustments up and down for that. And she discusses all those differences. And at the end, here's the part that I've been waiting for. She says, and I think your house is worth $385,000. Let's just say $385,000. I say, okay, thank you. I'll be in touch. I'll let you know either way. That's just polite, right? To let them know either way. Okay, now 2 more people visit the house, and they come in with these 2 numbers. $355,000, $345,000. What should your estimate of the true value of the house be? You could just average them, but I'm going to tell you something. This one appears to be an outlier, right? Isn't it pretty far away from these 2? Now, when a realtor tells you this number, the typical person, when they look at these 3 in picking their realtor, what are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, Sally can get me $385,000. Can Sally get you any more than any of the rest of these people? No. Take it from the realtor's son. No. What Sally's doing is trying to get you to be her client. And then what's going to happen is 60 days are going to go by. No one's going to make an offer. And then what's Sally going to say? She's like, well, apparently the market's a little tougher than we thought, right? She's going to say, we probably need to lower the price. What's she going to say to lower it down to? $350,000. So you could have gone with one of these people, marked your house at $350,000 and been done with this 60 days earlier. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say no to Sally, and I'm going to average these 2 and come up with a value of $350,000. And it turns out you can do the same thing with commercial real estate. Commercial real estate is sold by commercial realtors, and we have a few here in town. All you gotta do is get a hold of those folks and get them to do the same thing for your warehouse. And you might feel a little shady doing this, but what if we decide not to do the project? What do you think we might do with that empty building? Sell it? And if we sell it, who are we gonna get to represent it? One of those 3 people that we invited in. I'm not gonna interview more people, right? And so don't feel bad about bringing these people to get the numbers from them, because there's still a chance that you might sell it, and you've been honest with them the whole time. I'm thinking about selling, and I'm interviewing realtors, so you haven't made any promises to them, so you don't need to feel bad about that. Okay, so that's the building. What about an unused machine? Every factory I've ever worked in, there's always this in the corner machine, and it's covered with a tarp. You guys know what a tarp is? Okay, covered with a tarp. And like as soon as I can break away from the people that I'm with, I go over and I peek under the tarp to see what kind of machine's under there. It's always interesting. Now, what if I came up with a project down the road that could use that machine? Should I include a cash flow for that machine in my project analysis? Yeah, what can I do with the machine if I don't use it? Yeah, I can sell it. Yeah, how do I find out what it's worth? Back in the old days, we would have called a machine dealer. The machine dealer would come and tell you how much they're gonna pay you for it. Nowadays, you can go out and look at the internet, right? Keep in mind, if you see a machine that's identical to yours selling for $100,000, what do you think a dealer's actually gonna give you for that? Probably $80,000, because they've got to make some money, right? And so you have to figure out what is the margin the dealer's going to have to get out of that and back it down. Either way, though, you've got a number now to use as your opportunity cost. By the way, remember, these numbers are all swags, and so I suppose you could go ahead and use the full $100,000 on that machine, and if your NPV was still positive, not a problem, right? But either way, we have to include these opportunity costs, because if we don't do the project, we could sell the building, we could sell the machine, and we could get some money out of them. So those costs are incremental to the project. Are there any questions? Okay, see you next time.